Toxic masculinity has become something of a buzzword in recent conversations about gender. How can this be understood within the framework of Catholic feminism? If we look back at Genesis, our story of origin, we can see a clear rupture in the relationship between the first man and the first woman once sin enters the picture. This is typically called the fall, as human nature falls from divine grace into a state of separation from God. Before the fall, the dynamic between man and woman is characterized by harmony, reciprocity, and a common mission to be fruitful and to have shared governance over creation. After the fall, for the first time, we see conflict and a strict hierarchy between the sexes. As a consequence of sin, there is newfound separation and suffering in the work of man and woman. Their sexed bodies become a source of shame rather than joy. And the woman is told that her desire will be for man, and he will rule over her. What was originally a dynamic of reciprocal love is now a dynamic of conflict and domination. One of the central purposes of Catholic feminism is to cultivate the original or redeemed dynamic between the sexes on both a personal and communal level. The grace of Christ enables us to break out of a sinful dynamic and into a redemptive one. Let's connect this back to the conversation about toxic masculinity. I would argue that toxic masculinity and toxic femininity develop when men and women lean into this fallen dynamic of conflict and domination. Toxic masculinity is characterized by aggression, conquest, by the use of power to control, exploit, and oppress. Toxic masculinity normalizes fallen masculinity as an expression of real manhood, rather than a version of masculinity that is distorted by sin. True masculinity views the woman with a sense of wonder and respect. Toxic masculinity views and uses the woman as object. We can see this kind of masculinity at work in the worldwide sexual exploitation of women and girls in prostitution and sex trafficking, as well as the more socially acceptable realms of hookup culture and pornography. Even as women have gained increasing equality in education and the workplace, the widespread sexual degradation of women and girls has escalated. What then is toxic femininity? What does it look like when women lean into a sinful, fallen dynamic of conflict with men? I can think of several different examples. The first is when women respond to sexism by mimicking toxic masculinity and seeking to dominate and oppress. You can see this kind of toxic femininity at work in some forms of feminism, especially those that embrace abortion, which is an act of violence and domination against a vulnerable other. Another form of toxic femininity is when women see themselves as objects and actively participate in their own exploitation, rooting their identity and sense of worth in being an object of male desire. I would also argue that extreme forms of cancel culture reflect a toxic form of femininity that weaponizes the role of victim and loses sight of the dignity and humanity of men, seeing them only as an enemy. Ultimately, any gender dynamic that is driven by conflict and the desire to dominate is corrosive or toxic to the dignity of the human person and to healthy, fruitful relationships between men and women.